Okay, welcome back. In class, we have already looked at the introduction to the Gilded Age. We've looked at the growth of big business and how the economy changed during this latter part of the 1800s. We've looked at labor unions and their background, and this set of notes is going to be, okay, how did business and labor and government, how did they fight against each other and try to promote their own interests? We'll start with government regulation of business, and you'll notice that word regulation is in quotation marks because when it all boils down to it, government didn't really do just a whole lot. Now there were, during the Gilded Age, as the businesses take over these excesses, as you see in these political cartoons, here's Uncle Sam being shoved overboard by the trust, here's Standard Oil's monopoly getting its tentacles around everything. The people demanded that Congress do something about this. And so one of the things that Congress did in 1887, they created this thing called the Interstate Commerce Act, which did a couple things. Number one, it outlawed unfair pricing that the monopolies were engaging in. It declared specifically to railroads that their rates had to be what the government would decide would be fair and reasonable. And to monitor all this stuff, it created this thing called the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, unfortunately for the commission and the people that thought it was actually going to do something, in the law that created it, they didn't actually put in any real enforcement power. So the commission, had the ability basically to publicize findings and say, look, here's what these corporations are engaged in, but then they didn't have any power to stop it. Another law that Congress passed in 1890 is called the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the purpose behind it was to basically make monopolies illegal and stop some of the practices that businesses were engaging in together. And in order to make sure that they caught all of that stuff, they wrote the law very broadly, and they banned, quote, combinations in restraint of trade. That phrase is going to cause problems later on. We'll see that here in these notes. Now here's the thing with these two laws. Even though during the Gilded Age neither one of these laws really does a whole lot, we'll see here in just a second, they were important precedents because they're going to say, okay, now the government's going to be involved, and they're on paper, and we'll just need another generation of politicians to actually put the force of government behind them. Now, regulation of these big businesses, from the government point of view, was more successful on the state level. There are several states, especially in the Midwest, a few in the South, they're going to pass laws that were called Granger laws. The Granger movement, which we will see later in the Gilded Age, was on behalf of farmers. And so they would pass laws that were designed to protect farmers from the big monopolies, usually the big utilities and the railroads. In 1876, there's a Supreme Court case called Munn versus Illinois, where the Supreme Court declared that government did have the right to regulate business if that regulation was for the public interest. Now, usually, the courts are still going to side with the businesses. Government and courts, they find their bread and their butter from the businesses, so of course they're going to side with them. About 10 years after Munn versus Illinois, there's another case, Wabash versus Illinois. The Wabash Railroad was charging unfair rates, the state of Illinois believed, and since the Interstate Commerce Commission couldn't do anything about it, the state of Illinois said they would. The company was able to successfully argue that they were engaged in interstate commerce, trade between two or more states. And the Constitution specifically says that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce, not the actual states. There's another court case later called U.S. versus E.C. Knight, where the court limited the scope of the Sherman Antitrust Act and basically found that some of these monopolistic practices that the government had been trying to stop were, in the court's view, legal and fair under the Sherman Antitrust Act. In this case, it was that manufacturing of a product was limited to a single state. The manufacturing plant that turns out whatever product it is located in one state, and therefore regulating that plant is up to the state, not to the national government. And so these are, the court splitting hairs. And what ends up happening is by the time we get to the end of the Gilded Age, this is still the situation. If you'll notice here in this cartoon, we have the trusts walking in. Here's the copper trust, the steel beam trust, there's Standard Oil Trust, which we've talked about. Here's the sugar trust, it's part of EC Knight. Here, up above them, this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. You see their entrance to the Senate here. You see all the senators kind of looking up at what they want. And then here in the background, the people's entrance closed with a padlock on the door. And essentially, that's the relationship between government and business by the time we get through the Gilded Age. Now, we've talked about businesses and we've talked about unions. Businesses and unions don't get along. Unions are busy trying to get things for the workers. So businesses fought back against unions, just like they pushed back against the government. Businesses have a lot of tools to use against labor unions. The first one here is a yellow dog contract. What that was, it was a contract you as a worker would sign with your business, and that contract said that you as the worker would neither form nor join a union. And so they would have you sign these contracts, and if you were caught trying to form a union, then you could be fired, and you had absolutely no legal recourse because you signed a contract saying you wouldn't do that. For the businesses where unions did get started, or there was talk of trying to get unions started, businesses would occasionally use something called a lockout. Lockout is where the business would padlock the door and not allow the employees in. And on the one hand, we think, well, maybe that's kind of a good thing because now you don't have to work. Well, if you're not getting work, you're not getting paid. And so for these employees who were living paycheck to paycheck, when the businesses did that, and the employee said, well, how can I get paid? Well, simple. Tell us who's starting the union. People that were caught forming unions were often put on something called a blacklist. The blacklist was a list of people who were causing problems in the business's eyes, trying to form unions, trying to fight for the workers, and they would circulate these lists among the business owners in the area. Do not hire these people. And so it's real interesting if you start trying to do the research on labor history, if you get into this aspect of history, sometimes trying to find, what did this particular person do, what was their job, where did they work, it's really hard because if your name ends up on a blacklist, the only way to get a job in that area is oftentimes to change your name, go by an alias. But these blacklists would keep people from being hired and then keep them from agitating in a new business. More directly, they would also, if a strike actually broke out, they would use people called strike breakers. Strike breakers are usually people and companies that are hired to physically stop a strike, physically break the strikers. One of the companies that would offer this particular service is called Pinkerton's Detective Agency. They're usually known for private security, private investigation, security, personal security, but they also offered the idea of strike breaking, where they would go in and they would use force to make your striking workers go back. The term strike breaker is also sometimes substituted for this right here, hiring scabs. Scabs are replacement workers that were hired by the business during a strike. The strikers, of course, do not like scabs because we're out here on strike trying to keep the business from making money so that they will be forced to negotiate, and you're in there turning out the product that we were supposed to be doing anyway. A lot of times these scabs were immigrants and African Americans who are starting to move up into the north where most of these businesses are located. as far as strike breakers, a lot of them were also immigrants and African Americans. And so labor unions typically don't like these people because they were hired to force them to go back to work or take their jobs while they were on strike. The businesses would also use the government. Okay, the government is not very effective at regulating businesses, but they are effective at stopping unions. And so what the businesses would do is they would request the government intervene to break up strikes with the local police, the National Guard, the actual army. And then they could also go to the courts and get the courts to issue something called an injunction. An injunction is a court order to stop whatever it is, whatever activity it is you're engaged in. And so we get these injunctions to stop strikes, saying you are in violation of the court order. If you continue this, you can be thrown into jail. And the courts would do that through a different legal interpretation. By the time we get to 1890, they're using a different interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which I mentioned earlier. It was designed to stop businesses, but when they put in that phrase, it made illegal any combination in restraint of trade. The businesses would walk in and say the workers had combined to prevent trade through these strikes, and the courts would side with business. Now, how did the unions fight back? Several different ways. One was something called collective bargaining. Businesses liked to negotiate individual contracts with each individual employee, so you didn't exactly know who was getting paid what. I may be getting a better deal, so this guy wants higher pay. Well, what if his version of higher pay is less than what I'm making? So the unions would ask for collective bargaining, where the union negotiates a standard contract that all the workers in that particular business get to sign, and everybody's being paid the same rate and being treated the same. They also would occasionally engage in something called a work slowdown. A work slowdown is where the workers deliberately slow down their work. And they're doing this for one of two reasons. One is, look, before we threaten to walk out or anything, we're just going to slow down. We're going to cut into some of your profits here until you start negotiating with us. Or sometimes they would do it as an encouragement to business to hire more workers. Look, we are unable to keep up with this pace of production. If you want to produce more, you need to hire our friends. You need to hire back maybe people that you've laid off to try to get them jobs. There was also the occasional sabotage of equipment. This is a lot of times usually the machines that are starting to replace some of the workers. The skilled workers would sabotage the machinery and say, oh, well, your machine over there broke, so you can't get rid of all of us and replace us with unskilled workers. You need us here. Lastly, of course, there was the strike, which is where the workers walk out and they refuse to return to work until their demands are met. Now, strikes during the Gilded Age, the vote by the workers to go on strike is taken with a very serious attitude, because strikes in the Gilded Age quickly and often become very, very violent. And so when we as the workers would take a vote to go on strike, it was with the knowledge that the next time we meet, we will not all be here. Someone is going to die in the process of this strike that we hope is successful. So that gives you an idea of how bad some of the working conditions were when, okay, are you willing to fight and possibly die to get an extra, $1 a day? Well, yes, I am. That's how bad the conditions are. So some of the notable strikes during the Gilded Age. In 1877, there's this thing called the Great Railroad Strike. The Great Railroad Strike begins several years earlier. One of the conditions for it begins several years earlier with this thing called the Panic of 1873, an economic depression where, in order to stay viable, some of the railroads that survived went ahead and cut wages. Well, by the time you get to 1877, 4 years later, railroads have cut wages and cut wages and cut wages, And by this point, they're being paid less. The workers are being paid less than half of what they were getting before the Panic of 1873. So they want their wages brought back up. Okay? Workers in West Virginia and Pittsburgh are going to go on strike. Those strikes are going to spread to other places around the country. And what is done in Pittsburgh is the Army is sent in to break up the strikes. Local police in Pittsburgh and local police in other places had actually sided with the workers because they felt that their demands were just, and a lot of them have friends and family members that are there. And so the Army ends up having to be called in to stop the strike. And when that happens, the workers react with violence. And they will destroy railroad bridges. This is the destruction of the Lebanon Valley Railroad Bridge. They will burn railroad cars. Several thousand railroad cars were burned. And the strike ended up collapsing, partly because obviously the Army is sent in to break it up, but also because a lot of the people that had initially supported the strike, when the strikers become violent, people are turned away from that. They're turned off by that. Why did you become violent? Especially in one case, some of the strikers went and they started burning down the rail yard where the trains are made up, and the fire spread into town, and by the time it was extinguished, it had burned down half the town. So now you've burned down other businesses, you burned down houses where people just like you were trying to get by, and they supported you until you burned down their neighborhood and their livelihood. In 1892, there's a big strike called the Homestead Strike. This is going to be against one of the Carnegie steel mills. It's located in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And what happened is Carnegie and his company went in and bought the mill and were trying to make it more efficient. They were, pushing wages down and trying to get everybody on board with the swing shift and the 12-hour days, and just really pushing the workers. And finally the workers had enough, and they came to work to go on strike, and they took over the steel mill. When they did that, Andrew Carnegie turned to his chairman, this guy named Henry Clay Frick, and basically put handling the strike in his hands. Frick would refuse to negotiate with the workers, and with Carnegie's not really overt endorsement, but with Carnegie kind of allowing him to do whatever he wanted, he hired those Pinkerton's security guards to, in his terms, retake the plant. There were about 200 Pinkertons, and their plan was to float down the river, get to Homestead, and basically come up behind the steel mill. And when they did that, there was a shootout. I want to say it lasted, several hours, where these Pinkertons ended up stuck on barges out in the river, and eventually the Pinkertons had to surrender to the workers. Okay? Both sides had guns here, and so the Pinkertons were kind of marched through and out of town. When Pinkertons can't get the job done, Frick is going to ask the state National Guard to come in and restore order. And so again, here comes the Army. This will be the Pennsylvania military. But when they come in, they start fighting the workers, and within 2 weeks, the workers cannot sustain the strike. The strike fails, and then the union that had been put together in that plant was broken, and the company was back in charge of the mill. And that's kind of the way most of these strikes end. They end with the company back in charge. And our last big strike to mention here is in 1894, the Pullman Strike. And the Pullman Strike is another strike that has its roots in an economic depression, this time the Panic of 1893. Again, we have a company. This one would be the Pullman Car Company. The Pullman Company did several things. One, they built railroad cars. Two, they staffed some of the passenger cars. And then in a lot of towns, their employees worked in the rail yards making up the trains. Well, in 1893, Pullman was looking for ways to save money due to the Depression, and so what they did is they cut wages by a third. Now, their employees lived in what are called company towns. Towns and neighborhoods that are built by the Pullman Company, and then their houses are rented from the Pullman Company. So Pullman cut their wages, but did not cut their rents. And so your employer knows, or in this case, the person you're renting from knows you are bringing home less money, and they keep your rent the same, which really squeezed the workers. So another union called the American Railway Union calls for a strike. This is the union that was led by Eugene V. Debs. And they start the strike. Pullman goes to the courts and argued that the workers had combined to prevent trade. And the courts agreed and said, okay, the strike must end. However, Debs and the strikers aren't going to end the strike. And what ends up happening again is the Army has to be sent in to break up the strike. And the Army will break up the strike. Ultimately, what happens in order to get the president on board with this action is some people from Pullman get a rail car that had mail in it, the U.S. mail, and they pushed it into one of these yards where the people were on strike. And when the strikers the next morning refused to go back to work, the business's argument was, oh, well, they are preventing delivery of the mail, at which point the president said, okay, we can send in the Army to stop that, because as we all know, nothing stops the mail. All right, I hope these notes were easy enough for you to understand and see where all it is that government and business and labor all fit together in this fight during the Gilded Age.